All right, today we're going to go over how to construct the roll kit. The materials are pre-cut for you, so even though the instructions say you need a certain yardage of fabric and things like that, we have everything cut already. So you should have a piece of bias tape. Bias tape is, well, at least double fold bias tape has a fold in the middle with two folds into the side, kind of like how you made your lanyard. And it's cut on the bias, so it's got a slight amount of stretch to it and it won't fray on the inside because it's cut at a 45-degree angle. You should have some twill tape that is a tightly woven piece of tape that has selvages really close together here. And you're going to need about 40 inches of that will be cut in half. Then you're going to need a 4x6 piece of fabric. It can be the same color as your main fabric or a different one. It doesn't matter. It's going to be a pocket flap. And then the final thing that you'll need is a piece of fabric that is 20 by 26. And again, we've cut these out for you. One other thing that you'll need at a later stage that I forgot to mention is a button. And that's going to be important for your flap, but we'll demonstrate that later. I am going to just quickly iron this, so I'll leave you for a moment and I'll be back when this is ironed. Alright, I've pressed this at a low temperature made for synthetics. This is not a natural fiber, or this fabric is not made from a natural fiber, so it will actually melt if you have your iron set to the highest setting. So I have it all smoothed out and I'm going to start with my bias tape, which I'm going to cut in half. So I'm just going to line up those edges. And I'm going to take my scissors, pull it nice and tight, and snip it. So I'm going to be stitching this to each end of my roll kit material, and it's going to go on the short ends. These are just a tad bit uneven. You can see at this end it doesn't quite reach the whole way. That's totally fine because we're going to end up folding this side in 1.5 inches total, so it's going to cover up any of that edge that might be exposed. So let's head over to the sewing machine where I'll show you how to stitch bias tape onto these edges. Alright, bias tape is used to finish off edges, so that's how we're going to do it. This is double fold bias tape, which means that we can open this up and we basically sandwich our fabric between these two folds, and we stitch a narrow top stitch right here, and then that finishes the edge of our fabric. So you will notice as you're looking at bias tape that there's one edge that is just very slightly narrower than the other. You want to be looking at the narrower edge as you sew, so that as you stitch along this edge, you know you're catching the longer side underneath. If you do it opposite, you may not be catching the underneath and you wouldn't know because you can't see it. So this is my slightly narrower side up, so I'm going to arrange that on the edge of my fabric. As I'm sewing, I want to make sure that the edge of my fabric stays nice and snug up against the fold. I don't want it pulling out, otherwise my edge is going to be a little bit wonky. I'm not going to pin because sticking a pin in this narrow of a piece is really difficult and it can actually warp the fabric more than you really intend for it to. So I'm just going to be very careful. If you want to use clips, you can use those to attach your bias before you sew it, or you can just stitch very carefully. Now when we're sewing, this is a tip. You don't want to be sewing with the bulk of your fabric here because it's just messy to work with. So we always want to be stitching with the bulk of our fabric coming out to the left where it's not going to bother us, which means that I'm going to flip this all the way around so I can still see the narrower side up. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to line up my fabric with the folded edge, and I'm just going to tuck that right back over. And I'm going to be stitching with the edge of the inner prong of my presser foot. Okay, so it might be a little bit difficult to see, but the inner prong of my presser foot is where I'm going to line up this edge of the bias tape to get a nice edge stitch distance. So I'm going to line that up. I'm going to stitch forward and then stitch back and then continue on my way. And as I go, I'm just going to sort of open this up, tuck this in, make sure that it's flush with the fold. And I'm just going to try and keep that nice and neat and straight. Because bias tape stretches, and I believe this was my slightly longer piece, I'm actually going to end up with a teeny bit extra off the side, which is no problem. Back stitch and finish. Okay, so I've done one side. I'm going to repeat on the other side. This end you can see is actually going to end up being just a teeny bit short, but like I said before, we're going to end up double folding this by about 1.5 inches, which is quite a lot, so this won't show in the end. Okay, so now I have my bias tape attached to the short ends of my main fabric. Now it's time to fold up each of our edges and create a pouch for our pockets. So, one side is going to be folded up 3.5 inches. So from this edge to the fold will be 3.5. The other side is going to be 4.5. So of course I'm going to measure, but I do just want to point out that the fabric that you're using does not have a right or wrong side. So there is, at least for our purposes, some of them might have a very slight sheen on one side that could be considered the right side, but they're very, very similar, and it's up to you which side you choose. So I'm going to lay mine this way, and I'm going to make this side my 3.5 side, and this side is going to be 4.5. So you can feel free to use a sewing ruler or a measuring tape. I'm going to use a measuring tape just for now, so this is what I'm going to use, but you could use a sewing ruler. So this edge I'm going to fold up 3.5 inches, and I'm going to fold it like so. And then I'm going to use some pins to hold it in place because I have some other marks to make and I don't want it to shift and get messed up. So I'm going to measure here, and that is just exactly 3.5. So I'm going to pin right there. I'm going to do one in the middle, which I can tell that's a little bigger. That's 3.5. Lots of years of sewing has made me really good at guessing small measurements like that. And then last side, just slide that down a little. All right. So So that edge is 3.5. Now this side, I'm going to do 4.5. So I'm going to fold it up this way. It's going to be a little bit wider than this to hold a few things that are a little bit longer and taller. So that's a little too long, I can tell. Just gonna use my measuring tape, a little too much. There we go. And for this, I think 3 pins is sufficient, one on each side and in the middle, just to kind of keep it in place. This is a fairly tightly knitted or tightly woven fabric, so expect a little bit of resistance when you're putting your pins in, just because those fibers are so close together. Okay, and then my last measurement for just a little bit, 4.5. All right, so we've got those measured. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to measure 1.5 inches in from each raw edge side, and that's because we're going to do a double fold at the very end. Our last step is going to be to fold this 3/4 and then 3/4 again, which means that at 1.5 inches, that's where we want to start our marks for our pockets that I'll show you in a moment. So the first mark we're going to make is 1.5 inches in, and where this really matters is on your pockets. But you can mark it down here as well. For now, I'm just going to mark it from the raw edges on each of my 4 pockets, so I know where that begins, and we'll go from there. For this one, since I'm going to have to draw a straight line, I am going to use my sewing ruler for that, so I'm just going to lay this. It's got really handy lines on here, so I'm just going to lay this 1.5 inches from this side and mark a line. 1.5 inches from this side to mark a line. May not be able to see it on the camera, but I can see it. And then we'll come over to this side and do 1.5 inches as well. Oops. Oh, I put my pin almost right exactly on there. Okay, and then up here. 1.5 inches. Okay, now that I have those lines marked, I have my starting points for creating my pockets. The instructions on Canvas have some very specific pocket sizes, but they allow for a little bit of extra. So there are pocket sizes for the 3.5 inch fold side and the 4.5 inch fold side, and you can choose to arrange them in whatever order you want. Now, to avoid confusion, I'm just going to start on this side, and I'm going to start marking pocket distances, and I'm going to have a little bit left over here, and then I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So on the 3.5 inch pocket side, it says that for my machine needles, I need a pocket that is 2.5 inches wide. So that 2.5 inches is going to start from this point that I just marked, not from the edge, because remember that this is going to be folded over, and so if you start your pockets from this edge, you're going to have 1.5 inches of that cut off. So you're starting from this line that you marked. And I'm going to use my sewing ruler again because I can just mark straight lines from there, but you are welcome to use a seam gauge and kind of mark multiple points and draw a straight line, but a sewing ruler will be really handy for you. So the first pocket size that I'm going to make, I'm going to start from this line and I'm going to measure 2.5 inches. And I'm going to go this way so I can draw along it. So I'm going to go 1, 2.5 and line that on my blue line that I drew before. And I'm going to mark that. Now, something that is really important, which I've talked about before, but especially with this project, it's important that you're using a soluble marker, whether it's air or water or if it's chalk, something that will come out of fabric, because you're going to be stitching on these lines and they'll be exposed, okay? And I'm going to start at the top of my bias tape and mark that line all the way down to the fold. Now my next pocket needs to be 1 1/4 inches wide, so I'm going to go 1 1/4 inches, measuring from the last line I marked, and I'm going to draw that line. Next, I need a 2-inch pocket, so measuring from the last line I drew, I'm going to mark 2 inches. Down the side. The next pocket needs to be 1 1/8. So again, marking from the last line, I'm going to go 1 1/8 inch, which the sewing rulers have markings all the way down to 1/8 of an inch, which is very handy for things like this. I'm just going to slide that down a little bit. Try and find that. The end didn't get marked very well. Okay. 1 1/8. And I'm going to mark that line. Then my next one is 4 1/4. So this is going to be my pin cushion pocket. It's one of the largest ones, but this is one of the ways that, well, this is the way that you'll turn in your pin cushion. So I'm going to go 1 2 3 4 inches from the last line. And remember, this is all on your 3 1/2 inch fold side. So I'm going to mark that. And then I have a pocket that is 2 inches. So I'm going to mark 2 inches. Now, like I said, you can see that I have extra fabric at the end of that. When you take 20/40, you may have new supplies, so you could leave that open. If you have something you want to put in it right now, you could stitch, 1 or 2 pockets in there that will make that the correct size. For now, I'm just going to leave this as is, in case I have something else I need to do or that I want to put there. Now I'm going to mark my lines on my 4 1/2 inch side, and I'm going to start with a 3/4 of an inch mark. And because I left the blank side on this one, this is totally a personal choice. You do not have to do it this way. Because I left my blank side on this, my blank space on this side, I'm going to leave my other blank space on this side. So I'm going to start from here and work this way. That's just me being my weird self. So I need a line 3/4 of an inch away from this line I marked before. So I'm going to line my ruler up and mark a line 3/4 of an inch. Okay, then my next one is 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to do that again. Those are both pockets that could easily be used for your marking pens and pencils, and it's possible you may end up with more than one from your own purchasing, or in another class you may get another one. So we'll just leave 2 pockets there. And then we have for a pencil and a pen, even though you're not going to use pencil and pen on your fabric, it can be really nice for patterning, for ideas, when something hits you and you really just need to write it down or whatever, to have a pen or a pencil in your sewing kit. I always need a pen or a pencil, and I'm always missing one in my sewing room, so we're going to mark 2 more lines that are 3/4 of an inch for that. Then we're going to make a seam gauge line at 1 inch. So again, I'm measuring from the last line that I marked and just moving side by side. So I'm going to go ahead and do 1 inch there. And then we need 1 3/4. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that one. This one is for our shears, actually. Oopsies, dropped the pin. Okay. Then we need one, it's going to have a flap on it. This is what your pocket piece is for. So I'm going to go ahead and mark a 3 1/2 inch line from my previous. So 1 2 3 1/2. Just got to remind myself I'm reading this right. Basic counting skills coming back to help. What do you need math for, right? Okay, and then another 3.5 inch distance for, here we go, for a compass if you have one, which you'll need one, and you'll get one for 20/40. And then if you have some paper scissors, we're going to do 1.25 inch for that. Give us some space. And then we have a little gap here that I'm just going to leave as well. So we have all our lines marked on the pockets going from the top of the bias tape to the fold. And we've got a gap here and a small gap here, and that's okay. You can choose to make pockets there, or you can choose to leave it as is, but you're one step closer to finishing your roll kit. Our next step is going to be actually constructing our flap for the pocket that's going to have a buttonhole that goes over it. So you have this piece of fabric and you're going to fold it in half and make sure all those raw edges are matching. And we're going to stitch around 3 of the edges. You're going to leave the open edge, but you're going to stitch around the short side, the folded edge, and the other short side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that's quite small. That's the edge of the presser foot exactly on a Bernina sewing machine. It's a little bit further out on a Juki machine. So I'm going to start at this corner because that leads the bulk of my fabric out to the left. I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric with the edge of my presser foot. Make sure you back stitch, and I'm going to stitch short, fold, short. When I get my needle about 1/4 inch away from this folded line, I'm going to use my hand wheel and turn it until my needle goes into my fabric. I'm going to lift up my presser foot, rotate, and pivot, and it looks like I'm actually a little bit too far away from that edge for 1/4 inch. So I'm going to reverse what I just did, do one more stitch, rotate, and that puts me perfectly on the edge of the presser foot. So I'm going to keep going. When I get close, I'm going to go ahead and turn my hand wheel, put my needle down, lift my foot, put it back down. That's called a pivot, and continue onward. And back stitch. Okay, oops. Now you have a rectangle that looks like this, and we're going to flip it right side out. However, we do need to trim these corners right here. Okay, so I'm going to cut my corners off at a diagonal. I do not want to cut through my stitches, obviously, but I do want to cut quite close to them just to reduce bulk when we turn this right side out. So I'm just going to trim right there. You can see my corners are trimmed off nicely. I'm going to trim my thread as well. Then I'm going to turn this right side out. So I obviously have my open side unsewed. So I'm going to flip this, and I don't actually have my point turner with me, so I'm going to use something else that's nice and pokey. And I'm going to poke out my corners so that they're nice and square. They just look a little bit more professional that way. And then I'm going to top stitch. The directions say this is optional, but I would say that it's not because it will turn out a much better project if you top stitch. Now, it can be helpful for you to press this as well, so go ahead and go to your iron and press this nice and flat, making sure that all your seams are just nicely even at the edges. One isn't, you know, way folded over the other. Make sure they're nice and even. Press that flat so that you can easily top stitch. Okay, you can see how much that helped in terms of just keeping this nice and flat. So now I'm going to top stitch. I'm going to stitch above the areas that I already did to enclose it. So I'm going to start here, short edge, long edge, short edge, still leaving this edge open. stitch. And when I get very close, I'm going to put my needle down, rotate, pivot. I'm actually going to do one more stitch. Sometimes you got to do that. Just test the waters, see how close you are, because it can be difficult to tell sometimes. Keep going around that corner. Once again, when I get nice and close, perfect. Okay, and that just gives me a nice professional look to my flap. I'm going to trim my threads, and we're ready for the next step. All right, I'm now going to mark my buttonhole on here. So I'm going to mark it halfway between my two edges. So I'm going to use my seam gauge here just to see. So this ends up being just wider than 3.5, which is perfect. And what I want is I want half of this width exactly. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to mark my halfway point, which is right there. Okay, so I have halfway between. Another way to do that would be to fold this exactly in half and mark that point. Okay. So now that I've done that, I'm going to measure the length. Now, we have several different button types for you to use. And they're slightly different depths, like some of them are higher than others, I guess, or thicker, you might say. They all should be the same diameter. But I'm going to, and there's a formula on Canvas for how to figure out the length of your buttonhole, and I've already done that, so I'm going to mark my buttonhole length at 5/8. That may be different for you depending on what your button choice was, so don't just copy me blindly. Make sure you do the math to figure out the length of your button. And I'm going to place that on there and trace a line the length that I want my buttonhole to be. You do want to give it a little bit of gap from this bottom as well, because the closer it is to this edge, the more it's going to have integrity issues with your buttonhole being too close to the edge. So I gave mine about a little more than 1/4 inch possibly up there. It's not a certain science, but you do want a little bit of a gap there. I'm going to use my automatic buttonholer, which you should have learned to use in your sewing practicum. So I'm just going to show you quickly how to do that. And we're going to start with my needle right there. And I'm going to do a buttonhole. That up, trim my threads off, use my scissors to trim my threads nice and close, And then you're going to finish it like you learned. So we're going to dab a little bit of fray check and then trim it open. All right, as you may have learned in the practicum, a very little fray check can go a long way. So you just dab a very little on there. Make sure it kind of soaks into the fabric a little bit. And when that's dry, you're going to use your seam ripper to open the hole. You can also use your little scissors. As some of you may have learned during the sewing practicum, it's very easy for a seam ripper to just keep right on going. So you do have to be very careful. I like to start in the middle, so I just poke my seam ripper through all fabrics in the middle, and then I just very, very carefully slice through. Then I turn around and slice the other half so that I have my nice open buttonhole. I'm going to give that just a little more, don't want to go too far. There we go. So now I've got my nice buttonhole. All right, the instructions tell us to lay our pocket flap a ½ inch away from the bias tape edge. So I'm going to go ahead and actually use my seam gauge to measure that just so I have it right. We're working on the fold that is 4½ inches, and you have two pockets that are 3½ inches wide, and you can pick which one of those you want to use. So I'm just going to go ahead and use this one. So that's 3½ inches wide, just double checking, and then I want my pocket to be ½ inch away. So I'm going to mark a little line there and mark a little line there. So I have two lines that are ½ inch away from this bias tape edge. I'm going to lay my pocket on with my raw edge laying here, the right side of my pocket, so the up side of my buttonhole facing down. So I'm looking at the wrong side of my pocket, okay? And I'm going to lay it facing up, so my buttonhole is at the top. And I'm going to place it right here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch right across here, and then this is going to be folded over, and I'm going to do a stitching technique on the top. So I want this centered right between my two pocket lines and lined up ½ inch away, and I'm going to stitch that 1/8 of an inch away from this raw edge, which is very, very close. Oops. Gotta remove my buttonhole foot. All right, ready to roll. So I'm going to lay this, remember, right side down. I'm looking at the wrong side of my pocket. I want to make sure it lines up with the edges that I've made and that it lines up with my ½ inch away from the bias edge. Okay, that looks good. And then 1/8 of an inch is really close, like following the inside edge of that presser foot, inside prong. Start sewing, back stitch. And continue forward. Back stitch. All right, once I've done that, I'm going to fold this down, and I'm going to stitch a rectangle here to keep this nice and flat. Okay, so I'm going to start stitching along this top edge, and I'm going to stitch like a top stitch from this folded edge. So that's going to be like the inner prong of the presser foot for me. And I'm going to start and back stitch. Okay, and then I'm going to use the pivot method when I get to my stitching line. I'm going to rotate down. I'm going to stitch along this top stitch line that I've already made. And I'm going to go 3 stitches and stick my needle down. There's no science on how large your rectangle should be, but it shouldn't be too large. And then I'm going to stitch my way back. And once again, when I get to my stitching line, I'm going to stick my needle down, pivot, press your foot down, stitch to the end, back stitch, and I'm finished. I'm gonna trim those threads. Normally I would use my thread clippers, but my daughter was playing with them and I don't know where they are, where they ended up. So now I have this nice rectangle across the top. It lays nice and flat, and I've got a wonderful flap on my pocket. Now it's time for our pocket stitching. So we have all these lines marked along here that we need to stitch on. We don't need to stitch this first line. You can, but you don't need to, because what will happen is you're going to fold this, and we're going to fold this, and then we're going to stitch along here, so that will end up having a stitching line anyway. So we're going to start with the first line over, and you're going to back stitch at the start, continue down the line, back stitch at the end. Okay, and you're going to do that on all of the lines that you've marked on all of the sides. So let's get started. I'm gonna leave that there, don't have to sew that. So all my pockets are stitched from my one side. I'm gonna continue on the other. All right, so here I go again on the other side. Oh, and we don't need to sew that last one. So I've got all my pockets done. So here we have our kit with all our pockets sewn, and our flap is here. You would have a button here. That tutorial is separate, but we also have our 1.5 inch line marked. We do have the right side of the fabric up, and we're going to fold it towards the right side about 1/2 inch on each edge, and then stitch that down to give us a nice finish on there without threads showing. So we're going to do that on both sides. You can see on the back, sometimes we would go away from it, but we're actually going to turn it towards the front. We've made our 1.5 inch mark, And if we turn the edge over about a 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch on itself, then that should take you right about to your 1.5 inch line mark. So that's 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/2 inch. And that will get you to where you want to go. So I'm going to pick up my seam gauge and I'm going to measure, and I'll be using clips to keep this in place. I'm going to use my seam gauge and mark a 1/2 inch. My little plastic thing is super loose and really doesn't work that well, so I'm just going to look at the number. But if your plastic thing does function, that can be handy to put at your 1/2 inch mark, then you don't have to look so closely. So I'm going to line that up with the edge, and I'm just going to be very careful that I'm getting a nice 1/2 inch edge, and then I'm going to use my clip and I'm going to stick it on the fabric. I am going to clip all the way down this edge and then fold it again. So I'm just going to move along here with my seam gauge, mark 1/2 inch. You might have maybe your pocket edge is just slightly off your main edge. That's okay. There's a little bit of bulk on the bias tape spot, so I'm going to put a clip right on top of it, and I'm just going to move on down the line measuring 1/2 inch. All right, now that I've got that done, I need to complete my second fold, so I'm just going to start at the same end where I started before and flip that over right on top of itself. It should line up nicely with your 1.5 inch line mark. So you're going to stick a clip there. You don't need to keep the first ones you put in, so I'm just gonna take the ones I've already used and start using those on my new second folded edge. All right, and last clip there. So you can leave 2 to 3 inches in between your clips, but you definitely don't want to try using pins. Clips will be much more effective for you, and we have some of those in the lab. So I'm going to rinse and repeat for the other raw edge side, measuring 1/2 inch here and sticking my clips on. A little bit of bulk where the bias tape is, and I actually forgot I have a little bit of extra I need to trim off, so I'm going to do that now. And keep going with my folding. Okay, and then of course I need to do my second fold, so I'm going to grab a clip and continue down the line with that. I do have some fraying threads, and if you have those, you can either trim them off quickly with your scissors, or I'm just going to make sure that they get tucked into my seam allowance so they don't show. If they are showing while you sew, it'll be really hard. You'll try and pull them out and it'll kind of gather, so really make sure those are either trimmed or tucked in nicely. All right, so I've got my both edges clipped nicely and they're ready to stitch. I'm going to stick one more here on the bias tape just to keep that in place, and we're ready to go to the sewing machine and stitch right there along that edge at a nice edge stitch. Okay, so here we are ready to stitch along this edge. We're going to stitch close to the inner edge. I've got a little thread coming out, but I'll trim that in a moment. So it's going to be quite close, like 1/8 of an inch from the edge. So once again, I'm just going to line up that inner edge with the inside prong of my presser foot here. Put my presser foot down, go ahead and back stitch. and stitch my way down that line. Stop and remove clips as you go. Do that pins as well. Clips is the more obvious, so easier to pin a clip, but you should roll them before you stitch them. Having just a teeny bit of trouble, my needle actually popped out of the shaft, so I'm going to fix that. Alright, continuing on. That bulk with the bias tape gave me just a little bit of trouble, but my needle didn't break, so we'll just finish this and be done with the first side. And there we have it. So I'm going to turn this around and start at the other end so that the bulk of my fabric stays out of my machine. And if you have any trouble going over that bulk, I'll show you what to do. It can be a little bit tricky for your machine needle to get through that. So when I get to the bulk this time, I'm going to slow down, see how my machine does. I'm going to use my hand wheel a little bit and go really slow and just turn my hand wheel towards myself as I gently press the presser foot. Just give it a little extra, go nice and slow, no need to rush, help your machine out a little bit, and I'm past the worst of it, so I'll continue on. Use my hand wheel again. Doesn't feel like I'm having as many issues this time. Made it over pretty cleanly, and I'll continue on to the end. Back stitch, and there you have it. We've finished our roll kit, and it looks nice. Make sure that you watch the other videos for the button and grommet, but otherwise, if you just roll this right up, you'll have your grommet there and your twill ties that will just tie that up, and you have finished your roll kit.